Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I am a USA Today bestselling author and high school English teacher. And on this week's episode, we are talking to Dallin Kohler about his book, Pyro, The Quest for a Beautifully Elusive Snake. And when I got an email from Tory House's PR person, Scout, asking if I'd be interested, I was like, well, I don't particularly like snakes, but I'm willing to give it a try. And I'm glad I did, because I learned a lot. And even though I'm a little bit concerned about how many snakes are actually out there while hiking, this was a really fun, informative read. Before we jump into that, Dallin, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me on. To introduce myself, I grew up in Idaho, suburban Idaho. I did my undergrad at Brigham Young University, majoring in biodiversity and conservation. And currently I'm pursuing a graduate program, a master's degree in ecology overseas at Nanjing Forestry University in China, actually. That's not as relevant to the book, but I'm a herpetologist. Herpetologist, the root word herpetos is Greek for to creep or to crawl, which basically means that I study creepy crawly animals, specifically reptiles and amphibians. My primary love is snakes, and that's what the focus of the book is about. And so I'm glad to hear that hopefully it's improved your opinion of snakes at least a little bit.
Definitely, yeah. I was shocked to realize just how many snakes are just out and about hiding under things. I live in northern New Mexico and we do have a lot of rattlesnakes, and I've actually never encountered a rattlesnake here, which I'm glad about, to be honest. I've heard them on occasion and been like, okay, let's turn and let's not keep walking in that direction. But I grew up near the river in Kirtland, New Mexico. So we had lots of garter snakes and just that kind of regular snake, I guess, that you encounter. And my brother thought that it was great fun to catch them and throw them at us. So that's probably where some of my hesitancy about snakes.
Trauma there, I guess.
Yeah. Didn't really appreciate that. So your book is focused on one particular snake. So tell us a little bit about the book, Pyro, and where your interest came and why you ended up being focused on this one particular snake.
The short answer is the book stems from a period of my life for about 2 or 3 years where my life seemed to revolve around this one species of snake. Their nickname is pyros, which is where the title of the book comes from. That comes from their scientific name, Lampropeltis pyromelana. So pyro referring to fire because they have red patterning on their back, and then melana meaning black, like melanin, that root word there. And so these snakes, they're red, white, and black patterned. They're very, very beautiful snakes, very striking coloration. But despite this striking coloration, they're really, really hard to find. You'd think that with how much they stand out that they would be easy to find, but they're not hard to find. And so the book covers a couple years of my life as I was researching this species of snake, worked on a couple research projects that led to some scientific publications. And then also the narrative of the book comes from my adventures in the wilderness, essentially looking for these snakes. And so the book is kind of a combination of snake stories in the wilderness and then weaving in some of the scientific research, both my own and then mostly from other scientists that has been done about snakes. And that's part of my motivation for the book, was that there is so much interesting scientific literature that's published on snakes. There's probably thousands of publications every year in scientific journals that are related to snakes, but so little of that makes it to the public, I guess. There's a lot of the academic writing. It's very jargon heavy. A lot of papers are behind paywalls. Not many papers get picked up for media coverage, and oftentimes the media coverage is oversimplified or sensationalized. And so part of why I wrote the book was to help take some of those interesting scientific studies that have been done on snakes and condense them into easily understandable, kind of bite-sized chunks that an everyday reader can digest and really see how fascinating this group of animals really is.
Well, I have to say that did stand out, that the language, you do give scientific names and you introduce some of the terminology that the everyday person probably is not familiar with. But overall, the language is very accessible, easy to read, easy to understand, which is really nice. I read way too many, I think, scientific journal articles and things, which hopefully I can get a break from because the teaching program I was in finally concluded. And they're really hard to get through sometimes. And
yes.
You read the abstract and you're like, I'm not even sure what they're talking about in the abstract. So
Hmm.
It's intimidating to try to dive into something with that much scientific language. Even, I mean, the stuff I'm reading for classes and licensing is, focused on education, but there are still so many acronyms and all these
Hmm.
words that are not commonly used, that trying to get information to the public about a specific topic, like I said, even something like education, where it seems like that should be easier to pass on that information to parents and colleagues and stuff, even then it's really hard. So then when you're adding in all of the scientific terminology and the Latin names and everything, like that can get overwhelming really quickly, but you manage to keep it at a level where I think even younger readers, like high school age readers, would not have a problem understanding the information that you talk about. You put it in very friendly language that blends well with the narrative of what you're doing as well. Was that challenging to do, or through like just your interest and your conversations about these, did that come naturally to put it in language that a non-scientific person would understand pretty well?
At first, it was a little bit difficult, especially when I started initially working on the book. I was still in my undergrad and I was still becoming familiar with scientific research, reading my first scientific papers. And so there's definitely a learning curve that I went through. By the time I was towards the end of writing the book, I felt like I had a really good grasp on scientific literature. There's a podcast that I like to listen to that I'll shout out here called Herpetological Highlight, run by two guys named Tom and Ben, where they will do a similar thing. Well, they'll take a scientific paper and reduce it into an easily understandable format for the listeners. And I think I drew a lot of inspiration from them. But I think in some ways, especially a lot of snake ecology studies that are done in the field, the methods aren't that complicated. Sometimes it's just like the authors went out and they caught the snake and they saw if it musked on them or something. The paper will dress it up in this intense scientific jargon, but at the end of the day, a lot of the methods are actually not that complicated. And so once you get used to reading the jargon and you can and are able to look for keywords and things like that, then it got easier for me over time.
Well, that's good. And then I think just being able to pass that information on in an understandable way, definitely a skill that develops over time. You
Yeah.
get kind of like in your box of talking to other people who know what you're talking about. But it seems like with snakes, like that might be something that you find other people who are interested in. And you talk about that in the book. A lot of the other amateur or hobbyist herpetologists who aspire to be able to study and catch and document, but they don't necessarily have the formal training that you have. You introduced, which I didn't know about a lot of the resources that you mentioned in the book, like iNaturalist, and how helpful that can be for people who are interested to help further research through their efforts at documenting and taking pictures and noting locations. Tell us a little bit more about that, because I know, like, even though I don't necessarily want to encounter snakes every time I go hiking, there are plenty of people who love them as much as you do and would be interested in knowing more about how they can help and participate in some of this documentation and research.
Glad you mentioned iNaturalist. That's something that I hit on a couple times in the book. For those that aren't familiar, iNaturalist is a citizen science platform. They have a website, an Android app, iPhone app, and it's essentially where users can take observations, usually photos, or sometimes if you have sound recordings of bird calls or something, you can upload that too. But you upload it to the portal, people can help you identify what it is, and then once the observation meets certain criteria, it will get marked as research grade and it'll get indexed in some scientific databases, and scientists will use that information in a whole variety of studies. And so it's useful in a scientific sense, and also kind of like you mentioned, that it's a good way for somebody that's interested in the outdoors to learn a little bit more about the world around them. So I like snakes, obviously. And so if I see a snake, I know what it is usually, but I really enjoy using iNaturalist to be able to take a photo of, maybe there's this nice cactus that's flowering and I don't know what it is, but if I take a photo and I put it on iNaturalist, other people can help identify it. And then any scientist that was studying maybe the timing of flowering of that species of cactus can be able to access that observation data and use it in their research. And so that's just a little bit about iNaturalist and citizen science. But it's something that I feel passionate about because it's helpful, and also because I feel like it's a very wholesome hobby to have. And the iNaturalist, the community online is a very, very friendly community. I think it's probably the only place on the internet where disagreements almost basically always will stay friendly, which is a rarity these days.
Well, and I was intrigued that so much of the data that you found there, or that people post in the community logs, really can be quite helpful because, like you said, it's really hard to find some of these different species. And you talk about going on I think it was like about a 2-week excursion to various places looking for specimens, and just the difficulty in it's got to be just the right temperature and elevation, and like all of these factors need to come together to be able to find the specific species that you're looking for, and the time that scientists have to study may not line up with that. So I was struck by how challenging some of this research can be, just because the access to what you need to research might not actually be there. But through the citizen scientists, you can actually gather more data and find information at various times that can really be beneficial. And that was something I hadn't really thought about or considered. I've used like different like plant identifying apps, and at one point interviewed a guy who does birds, and so there was apps for that, and I hadn't really considered that that could also end up being useful data for researchers who maybe can't access what they're looking for all the time, but can find some of those instances through these postings and contributions on sites like that. That was really cool to learn more about that.
Yeah, to be honest, that was something that I think you get a little bit of my naivety at the beginning of the book, where I didn't realize I decided to research pyros at first, but I didn't really have any idea how difficult it was going to be to be able to find them, to be able to have any sort of a research project. And so the projects that I ended up doing utilize collections or specimens in museum collections, as well as iNaturalist observations to supplement. It is amazing how much easier it can be to have these big data sets already being produced by millions and millions of users around the globe. It's much more efficient for most projects than having one scientist out trying to go find as many of the snakes as he can.
Well, and I did want to lead into, you do give some recommendations for those who are interested in participating in this sort of thing. Some things like, let's not do that, like taking the snakes home or various other things. So your advice, and for those who maybe have not participated in this way but would like to, what cautions would you give people so that they can do it responsibly?
Yes, so for people that are interested in snakes in particular, this might sound crazy to people that are afraid of snakes, but a lot of people that like snakes, there's been kind of a bad habit of a lot of herpetology enthusiasts, a lot of snake enthusiasts, to bring snakes home and have them as pets. And that's something that I think is becoming less and less accepted in the community. I think a couple decades ago, that was pretty standard for snake hobbyists to bring whatever they catch home and keep it as a pet. But it's kind of gone a little bit away from that. And so that's one of my major suggestions, is for those that are into snakes, it's really just best to enjoy them in the wild. Even if taking one snake home has a really minimal impact, I think it's really ironic for the people that love snakes the most to be contributing to their declines, because there's so many other factors, things like habitat loss. For some species, climate change is impactful. And so it seems ironic for those that like the snakes to be giving them another push towards being threatened or extinct and things like that. In terms of other recommendations, in terms of being a responsible nature enthusiast in the wild, a lot of times it can be fun to look under rocks or logs for snakes or for insects. Lots of creepy crawlies will hide under cover. And so it's always good if you're flipping a rock over, to just make sure to put it back in the place and try and have it, if it's created some nice micro habitat, some shelter underneath for creatures to take refuge. And so if you turn the rock over and you don't put it back, you've just destroyed that nice little micro habitat for them. And so it's always good to put whatever cover you flip over, put it back. Yeah, and there's other things. Just don't litter when you're out in nature, and just being a responsible outdoors person. Pack it in, pack it out. Things like that are all good things to remember when out looking for snakes or other wildlife.
Well, what was some of the things that throughout this 2-year period when you're documenting, all of the species and you're kind of keeping track of what you're doing, what would you say was the most interesting or surprising thing that you learned over the course of this research period for you, either personally or about what you were studying?
I think the most interesting thing that I guess it maybe sounds cliche, but the most interesting thing that I learned was that snakes are hard to find. I think I knew that before, but they are difficult to find. And then I guess the other thing that I would say that I really learned is I just felt like partly because they are hard to find and partly because of just all of these experiences, I felt like I had a much deeper appreciation for the intrinsic value of nature. That I think oftentimes you hear arguments for conservation in terms of economic value, just like, oh, conserving this wetland ecosystem will help with flood prevention and save us X millions of dollars in the next 10 years from preventing floods. And I think that's a valid way to think of conservation. But I think throughout my time researching the book and having these adventures in the wilderness, essentially, that I got a real stronger sense of appreciation of the non-quantifiable value that nature really has. And I think that anybody that spends a lot of time in the outdoors will come away with that feeling of just that nature has a value that is non-quantifiable, that's there, that's real, that is something that is good for the soul, I guess I would say, but that is hard to put a number on it. Those are my biggest takeaways.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Some of the more recent interviews I've done have been with retired park rangers and talking about wilderness and national parks and just those protected areas. And it was really interesting to me to learn a little bit more, particularly about wilderness areas, because like we have them here in this area. We have quite a bit of public land, either BLM or state or national parks. And it was always just kind of like, yeah, I don't know, like they're designated differently for whatever reason. I hadn't really learned the definition, I guess, of some of those. And it was interesting with the Wilderness Act because it wasn't necessarily like, sometimes, yes, there is something archaeological or specific species or something like that. But really part of the Wilderness Act is just to protect land so that there is somewhere to go that's away from people, away from technology, away from civilization, so people can just have a space to actually experience nature untouched and get away from everything. And I think that becomes so much more valuable on an individual level for people, the more we're just like constantly bombarded with everything. I know there's plenty of times that I'm like, oh, just a nice quiet spot, like to just get away from stuff, to enjoy the animals, the plants, just the environment overall. And some of the places that you were able to go and that you wrote about in the book, some were just public areas where you could go out hiking and that were pretty widely used by the community, it seemed like. And then others were a little bit more remote. And as the reader, I did get that sense of, like you said, just that beauty attached to nature and that need to be in it and experience it. And, you know, whether it's for scientific purposes, for documenting, looking for things, or just being out there to be in that space, that is a really valuable thing. And the idea of protecting those areas and keeping them for future generations. And then, you know, and you add to that with your discussion of what you find in the various places of protecting those life forms, whether, you know, flora, fauna, all of those, and seeing just how intricately they all work together to create these habitats and ecosystems. So I was going to ask you, just tell us a little bit about some of the places that your research over this time period of the book took you to, because even though I live in this area, there were still several that I was like, I've never even heard of that. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, I'll tell you about two places, I guess. I think, let me write the names down so I don't forget the second one. The first is the Sky Islands. That's probably closer to where you are. It's Sky Islands of the southeastern or southwestern U.S. Sorry, sometimes called the Madrean Archipelago, even though it's not a real archipelago because they're not real islands, but just these. They're called Sky Islands. What they are is they're essentially these mountains in the middle of the desert, and they rise up from the desert and create these isolated ecosystems that they're not islands in the sense that they're surrounded by water, but they are in the sense that they're surrounded by largely inhospitable desert on all sides. And obviously there are animals that do live in the desert too, but there's very distinct ecosystems that occur on these sky islands where you'll have the desert surrounding the island. And then as you go up and up and up, you'll get gradually different types of vegetation to the point where once you get high enough on most of them, you get just these whole pine coniferous forests surrounded on all sides for miles by just like desert and saguaro cactus. And it's just a totally different landscape that you get on some of these sky islands. And what's interesting from a biologist's perspective is that these islands are often hotspots for biodiversity, where these animals that aren't able to survive in the more harsh desert environments are able to survive, but in isolated areas on these sky islands. And so that leads to a higher degree of speciation. So there's more species. There's often endemic species that are only found in a few sky islands, or sometimes even one sky island. And so there's a lot of interesting biodiversity. And I think I'm trying to remember how I described it in the book, but you can think of it sort of as, instead of with your traditional island, you have water and you might have coral in the water surrounding the island. And your sky islands, you have this desert and you've got the cactus instead of coral. And then you go up, and in your island, you have just a totally different set of life, much like in your actual island, comparing the marine life to the life on land. Yeah, so the sky islands of the southeastern U.S. are one of my favorite places. They're absolutely beautiful just for their really distinctiveness, their feel that they have different from their surrounding area. The second place that I would highlight that I really like is the Deep Creek Mountains. And they're in far western Utah, really close to the Nevada border. The Deep Creeks are funny because at the time I was living in Utah, and everyone that I talked to that I'd said, I'm going to the Deep Creeks, or I went to the Deep Creeks last weekend, no one had ever heard of the Deep Creeks, which is really bad. It was really sad to hear because they're such a interesting and such a wild place, I guess. And in a way, the Deep Creeks are also a sky island. They're not usually referred to as sky islands, but in the sense that they are this big mountain range that's surrounded by miles of sagebrush and hot desert. And there are these beautiful pine forests up the Deep Creeks, these nice montane creeks, nice wetland, not really wetland, but riparian habitats, and these streams that have native trout still in them, and areas with nice, beautiful granite canyons. Yeah, so I could describe it poorly more, but I would just recommend, if you want to go to a very, very wild place, the Deep Creeks are a very good place to go. There's no cell service, which I think adds to the wildness, but they are a great isolated place.
Yeah, both of those I had never heard of before, but I was telling my fiance about them as I was reading. We were both like, I think we should add those to our list of places to go check out and explore. So hopefully we'll make it there maybe next summer. But yeah, tell us a little bit about what at the end of this book, you kind of close off that you're getting ready to leave and go to graduate school and on to that next phase. But this is obviously something that you have a continuing interest in. Do you plan to write any more books and telling a little bit more about your experiences, or are you focusing on academic pursuits and writing right now? What do you have planned?
In terms of books right now, I don't have anything planned. I'm not really working on anything. My graduate program over in China right now is focused mainly on amphibians, a lot of frog research, catching frogs at night, which is fun, and I enjoy it. But I will say that I guess my true love is still with snakes, and so I don't know if I'll be writing a frog book necessarily anytime soon. But my goal after graduation is to ideally work for a nonprofit doing some sort of conservation work, and so maybe that will inspire my next book. But we'll see.
Yeah, well, I hope it does, and that you continue to share your adventures. I have to say, like, as a mom, I was like, oh my gosh, don't just grab snakes. It was interesting, though, to realize, like, how many snakes are not harmful. They're not venomous. Like, they are just out there doing their own thing. So on that level, like, I did find out a lot and learn a lot about all of the creatures that you talked about. That helped me be a little bit less wary and scared of them, which was really great. But for you, as the person writing this, there's a lot of information. It's part memoir. What do you hope that people take away from this story of these 2 years of you researching and exploring and adventuring and having these interactions with the natural world?
I think the major takeaway is, I think what it sounds like you have taken away is, I hope that the readers will come away with a deeper understanding of and appreciation for snakes and for a lot of the other wildlife that doesn't tend to get a spotlight in most nature writing. You don't hear a lot of nature writers writing about lizards or things like that. But these animals are just as interesting as the wolves or the dolphins that might usually get the spotlight in nature writing. And so the main thing that I hope that readers take away from it is that deeper appreciation for snakes, whether that's somebody that was afraid of snakes, realizing, oh, maybe the snakes they're not out to get me, they're not as dangerous as I might think, or for somebody that was already into snakes, for them to be able to take away some of the more intricate parts of understanding their biology or things like that. I think this is kind of related to the other main takeaway that I kind of have, intended takeaway, is I hope that people come away from the book with a better understanding of how science works. In a lot of ways, modern science is kind of opaque to the general public. It operates in a language that's difficult for people to understand. And it's at a time when I feel like public trust in science as an institution seems to be at an all-time low. And I think part of that is because in all types of science, it seems that it's hard for an everyday person to know really how it works, know what's going on behind the scenes, both in terms of like, how is scientific research funded? How is it executed? How are these papers going through peer review? And how is this research getting published? And so in the book, I've tried to, in some parts, sort of peel back the curtain of science and show readers why the scientific establishment, or why science as an institution, is something that should still be highly trusted today. Those would be the two main things that I hope readers take away: appreciation of snakes and a better understanding of the validity of science.
And I think you did really well with both of those. Like the peer review and things like that are things that me personally I'm a little bit more familiar with, but I know that that is not something that most people encounter on a day-to-day basis. And I think especially with so much information and it being so hard to trust what's coming from where right now in the world, having a better understanding of that process, I think does help people not only kind of pick through what is trustworthy and what's not, but understanding the process and what that looks like. I think you accomplished those two things, at least for me as the reader, and I hope that other people take the time to check this out and learn a little bit more about everything you talk about in the book. It was a fun read. I learned a lot, and yeah, I'm a little less afraid of being attacked by snakes when I go out hiking. So that's good. And I know I just, move aside, let them do their thing. They don't want to be bothered any more than I do. Mm-hmm. So accomplished on that as well.
That's great.
Now, Dallin, it is time to wrap up. But before we go, tell people where they can find you online and the book, and just where they can stay in contact if they'd like to.
Yeah, so the book, let's say the title again. The book is Pyro, The Quest for a Beautifully Elusive Snake. It's available directly from Torrey House Press at torreyhouse.org/pyro. It's also available at Amazon, as well as a bunch of independent booksellers in the Western United States. And I'm on Instagram. I think if you just search my name, Dallin Kohler, it will pop up. My handle is kong.nature, K0ng.nature. But if you search Dallin Kohler, it will pop up.
And we will put links to the book on Torrey House in the show notes for those who want to go check it out there and support independent nonprofit publishing. Well, thank you so much, Dallin, for taking the time to chat with me. I'm glad I got the opportunity to read and to get to know you a little better.
Thanks so much. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and thanks for having me on.